On February 7th, 2018, at 2:30 in the afternoon, a 49-year-old man walked away from his friends at a ski resort in upstate New York to make one last run down the mountain. 6 days later, he was found nearly 3,000 miles away in California, still wearing his ski clothes, with no memory of how he crossed the country. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what comes next. The phone call came from Sacramento. When the woman answered, the voice on the other end was familiar but disoriented. He called her by a nickname only the two of them knew. She was certain it was her husband, the man she'd been searching for, the man whose face had been circulated across news stations for nearly a week. But the location made no sense. He'd vanished from Whiteface Mountain in Lake Placid, New York, and now he was calling from an airport rental car facility on the opposite side of the continent. Michael Patterson was a fire captain, 28 years with Toronto Fire Services, a family man with 2 grown sons. Every February, he and his colleagues took an annual ski trip to Lake Placid. It was a tradition they'd maintained for years. Familiar faces, familiar slopes, familiar routines. The kind of trip where nothing unexpected happens because everyone knows what to expect. On that Wednesday afternoon, the group had been skiing since morning. The weather was cold but clear. Whiteface Mountain was busy with skiers enjoying the late winter conditions. Around 2:30, most of the group decided to take a break. They gathered at the mid-station lodge, that halfway point on the mountain, where skiers paused to rest before continuing down. Michael's friend mentioned he was tired, ready to call it a day. But Michael wanted one more run. Just one. The lifts would close at 4. There was still time. He was an intermediate skier, confident but not reckless. He knew the mountain. He'd been coming here for years. His friends watched him head toward the slope. Green jacket, black helmet, red skis. Nothing about the moment seemed unusual. Nothing suggested it would be the last time they'd see him for nearly a week. When the ski center closed at 4 o'clock, Michael's friends went looking for him. They found his car in the parking lot. His boots were in the lodge, his belongings exactly where he'd left them. But Michael himself was nowhere on the mountain. By 4:30 that afternoon, they reported him missing. The response was immediate. The Department of Environmental Conservation sent forest rangers. State police coordinated with Whiteface Mountain staff. Within hours, a search operation was underway. This was not common. John London, a spokesman for the authority that runs Whiteface, later said he had no memory of anything like this happening before. Not at this scale. Not with these circumstances. The search grew larger each day. Helicopters scanned the slopes from above. Dogs tracked scent patterns through the snow. Drones captured footage of terrain too dangerous for ground teams to access. Volunteers joined professionals, combing through woods and ravines. The conditions were harsh. A storm moved through the area, dumping several inches of fresh snow. Temperatures dropped well below freezing. Search crews worked in shifts, covering the same ground multiple times, looking for any sign of the missing skier. The search pattern followed established protocols. Start with the last known location. Expand outward in systematic grids. Check high-probability areas first. Ravines where someone might have fallen. Dense forests where someone might have sought shelter. Open areas visible from above. The teams communicated through radio, coordinating their movements to avoid gaps in coverage. Whiteface Mountain isn't small. The ski area covers hundreds of acres. The surrounding wilderness extends far beyond that, but it's not infinite. There are boundaries, roads, neighboring properties, places where a person on foot would eventually encounter civilization. The search teams knew this. They established perimeters. They monitored access points. They checked with neighboring communities to see if anyone matching Michael's description had been seen. Nothing emerged. No tracks. No discarded equipment. No signs of someone having passed through. It was as if Michael had simply ceased to exist the moment he left his friends that Wednesday afternoon. His skis were never found. His helmet stayed on his head until California, but the skis that should have been with him vanished. Whether he was still wearing them when he left the mountain, whether he abandoned them somewhere, whether they were lost in a fall, No one knows. The dogs couldn't pick up a trail. Scent tracking relies on particles of human odor depositing on surfaces and in the air. In ideal conditions, trained dogs can follow trails days old. But the storm complicated everything. Fresh snow covered old scent markers. Wind dispersed odor particles. The cold affected the dog's ability to detect faint scents. Despite these challenges, the handlers kept trying. They brought the dogs to Michael's car, to his belongings, to places he'd definitely been. The dogs would start tracking, then lose the trail within a short distance. By the second day, more than 100 people were actively searching. Fellow firefighters from Toronto arrived to help. They knew Michael. They understood what was at stake. The search expanded beyond the immediate ski area into the surrounding wilderness. Teams worked through the night, their headlamps cutting through darkness, their voices calling out into the cold. The firefighters brought a particular intensity to the search. This was one of their own, someone who would have done the same for them. They organized their own teams, coordinated with the official search operations, and covered areas that might otherwise have been given lower priority. They checked places a skier shouldn't be but might have ended up if disoriented or injured. They rappelled into steep ravines. They probed snowdrifts deep enough to conceal a body. They did everything they could imagine might help. His wife remained at Whiteface, waiting. The fire chief described Michael as outgoing, positive, larger than life. Friends spoke about his dedication to his family and his work. Everyone expected him to be found. Everyone believed the search would end with him walking out of the woods. Cold, perhaps, maybe injured, but alive. On the third day, the search continued. Over 9,000 person-hours had been invested. Every reasonable area had been covered. The terrain was rugged, but it wasn't endless. The mountain had boundaries, road access points, places where someone would eventually emerge. Yet there was no trace of Michael Patterson, no ski tracks leading away from the resort, no evidence he'd left the mountain on foot. His equipment was still there. His vehicle hadn't moved. The theories discussed among search coordinators were practical. Perhaps he'd taken a wrong turn and become disoriented. Maybe he'd fallen in an area that was difficult to spot from above. Injuries could prevent him from responding to search calls. But as the days passed, those theories became harder to sustain. The search was comprehensive. If he was on that mountain, they would have found something. By the fifth day, the mood had shifted. Hope remained, but it was mixed with growing concern about what the outcome might be. Search operations at this scale can't continue indefinitely. Resources are finite. Weather can deteriorate. At some point, difficult decisions have to be made about when to scale back or suspend effort. No one wanted to reach that point, but the reality was approaching. On the sixth day, February 13th, the search was still active. More than 160 personnel were involved. The commitment hadn't wavered. Then, just after noon, Michael's wife received a phone call that changed everything. The voice was confused, groggy, but when he used that private nickname, she knew. She asked where he was. The answer didn't make sense. Sacramento, California. She told him to stay on the line. She told him to call 911. The call dropped. Minutes passed. Then he called back. This time she kept him talking while others traced the location. Deputies from the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department responded to a call about a suspicious person at the airport rental car facility. They arrived to find a man in full winter gear, snow pants, ski jacket, sorrel boots. He was still wearing his helmet. In California, in February, in weather that required none of it. The man appeared disoriented. He didn't know what day it was. He had a credit card and nearly $1,000 in cash, but no identification. When they asked his name, he told them. When they asked how he got there, he couldn't say. The deputies recognized immediately that something was wrong. This wasn't typical confusion. This wasn't someone who'd had too much to drink or was experiencing a mental health crisis in the usual sense. The man was wearing ski equipment thousands of miles from the nearest ski resort. He had money but couldn't explain where he'd been or how he'd arrived. His confusion seemed genuine, not performed, not exaggerated, just real uncertainty about basic facts of his recent existence. Sergeant Sean Hampton handled the initial response. He documented the condition Michael was in, the clothes, the equipment, the cash, the single credit card, the complete absence of identification. Hampton had handled hundreds of calls involving confused or disoriented people. This one was different. The details didn't fit any familiar pattern. Homeless individuals sometimes became disoriented but didn't carry $1,000 in cash. People experiencing psychiatric emergencies didn't typically arrive at airports in winter sports gear with no apparent reason for being there. Hampton asked basic questions. Where are you from? Where were you going? Who can we contact? Michael answered some, but not others. He knew his name. He knew he was married. He could recall the nickname he called his wife. But he couldn't remember her phone number initially. He couldn't explain why he was at an airport. He couldn't describe how he'd traveled to California. When asked where he'd been the past week, he had only fragments. A truck. Cold. Sleeping. Utah. Nothing that formed a coherent narrative. The call to his wife had come just before the deputies arrived. Michael had purchased an iPhone somewhere in Sacramento. He'd managed that transaction. Walked into a store, explained he needed a phone, completed the purchase. But he couldn't remember his wife's number. It took him roughly a day to recall it. During that time, he wandered the city, still in ski gear, still wearing the helmet, in weather that didn't require any of it. And no one reported seeing him in a way that later helped investigators track his movements. The New York State Police were notified. Photographs were sent from California to the command center in Lake Placid. The search crews confirmed the identity. The man they'd been looking for across frozen slopes and through dense forest wasn't there at all. He was 2,500 miles away, standing beside a car rental desk, wearing the exact same clothes he'd disappeared in. The reaction among the search crews was complex. Relief that he was alive. Confusion about how this was possible. Some frustration that days of intensive searching had been looking in entirely the wrong place. But mostly disbelief. How does someone travel from New York to California without leaving a trail anyone can follow? How does someone cross most of the country in winter ski gear without dozens of people remembering and reporting it? Michael told deputies he remembered very little. He thought he'd been injured. He believed he'd ridden in a big rig truck. He said he'd slept a lot. He remembered the truck driver telling him they were in Utah. Later, the driver dropped him off in Sacramento, still in his ski gear. He said he'd gotten a haircut somewhere. He'd purchased an iPhone so he could call his wife. It took him a day to remember her number. Beyond these fragments, there was nothing. 6 days reduced to scattered impressions without context or continuity. The medical evaluation began immediately. Doctors suspected a head injury. Concussions can cause amnesia. In about a quarter of cases, memory loss occurs. Sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours, rarely for days. Michael's case was unusual in its duration. Dr. Charles Tater, a brain surgeon specializing in concussions, reviewed the details. He confirmed that the symptoms aligned with traumatic brain injury, the confusion, the memory gaps, the islands of recollection separated by blank space. But even he acknowledged this was on the extreme end of what concussion typically produces. Concussions affect people differently. The brain is not a simple machine with predictable responses to damage. Two people can sustain similar impacts and experience completely different outcomes. One might recover within hours. Another might struggle for months. The variables are numerous. Age, prior injuries, the specific location of impact. Even genetic factors play roles in determining how severe the effect will be and how long they'll last. In Michael's case, the amnesia covered not just a moment of injury, but everything that followed for 6 days. That's called anterograde amnesia. The brain loses its ability to form new long-term memories. People in this state can hold information temporarily. They can have conversations. They can navigate spaces. But nothing commits to permanent storage. It's like riding on water. The information exists briefly, then disappears without trace. There's also retrograde amnesia, where memories before the injury vanish. Michael seemed to have both. He couldn't remember the injury itself. That's typical. The brain doesn't record the moment of trauma. But he also couldn't remember the days following. That's less common. Most concussion-related amnesia resolves within hours. Days of continuous memory loss suggest something more severe. Yet Michael showed no obvious signs of major brain trauma when he was found. No skull fractures, no bleeding, no indications of the kind of injury that typically produces amnesia of this duration. The scan showed changes consistent with concussion, but nothing that explained 6 full days of memory loss. That discrepancy troubled the doctors, not because it made the diagnosis impossible, but because it pushed the boundaries of what they understood about how brain injuries manifest. Another specialist, Dr. Jennifer Ryan, suggested a different possibility, a dissociative fugue state. This is a psychological condition where someone travels distances without conscious awareness of their actions. It can be triggered by head trauma or by severe emotional disturbance. In fugue states, people often don't remember the travel itself. Memory returns when they find themselves in an unfamiliar location. That matched one detail from Michael's account. He didn't remember leaving New York or traveling through multiple states. His first clear memory was being told he'd reached Utah. Fugue states are rare. When they occur, they typically involve people with underlying psychological vulnerabilities. Stress, trauma, dissociative disorders. These create conditions where the mind can separate from conscious awareness. The person continues functioning, but without conscious direction or memory formation. They're on autopilot, following basic routines and responding to immediate needs, but not recording the experience. Michael had no history suggesting vulnerability to this condition. No prior episodes. No diagnosed mental health issues. No recent traumatic events beyond the injury itself. That didn't rule out fugue as an explanation. First episodes can occur without warning, but it made the diagnosis less certain, less clear-cut than doctors prefer when explaining unusual cases. What both explanations had in common was the acknowledgement that something disrupted Michael's normal cognitive function, whether purely physical through brain injury or psychological through dissociation or some combination of both. His brain had stopped operating normally, and that disruption lasted 6 days, long enough for him to travel thousands of miles without awareness of doing so. Investigators tried to piece together the route. Michael's credit card showed activity, but the details weren't made public. His passport was at the hotel in Lake Placid, which ruled out air travel. There were no records of him boarding a bus or train. That left the truck. But Route 86, the main road from Whiteface Mountain, doesn't see much interstate truck traffic. Major John Tibbetts from the state police noted this discrepancy. How did someone on foot in ski gear flag down a long-haul trucker on a road where those trucks rarely travel? The truck driver was never identified. Authorities asked anyone who might have seen Michael during those 6 days to come forward. No one did. Not the driver. Not the person who cut his hair. Not the store clerk who sold him the iPhone. No surveillance footage surfaced. No witnesses reported seeing a man in full ski gear traveling across the country in the middle of February. For 6 days, Michael Patterson moved through public spaces, interacted with people, covered thousands of miles, and left almost no trace. Toxicology reports were not publicly disclosed. Michael's colleagues vouched for him. Firefighters undergo regular drug testing. His friends said he'd never touched drugs. There was no indication of substance abuse. No history of mental health issues. No reason to suspect this was anything other than what it appeared to be. A man who went missing and couldn't account for how he'd traveled across the country. The search had cost tens of thousands of dollars. More than 250 people had participated. Helicopters, drones, dogs, specialized equipment, all deployed to find someone who wasn't there. When asked about the expense, officials declined to provide an exact figure. Major Tibbetts said the priority was understanding what had happened. He emphasized that Michael had broken no laws. He wasn't a suspect. He was a victim of circumstances no one could yet explain. Michael returned to Lake Placid briefly to speak with investigators. The interview details remained confidential. He cooperated fully. He wanted answers as much as anyone, but he had none to give. The neurological testing continued. 3 separate evaluations confirmed brain injury. The doctors said he would likely recover physically, but the memory gaps might never fill in. Some amnesia, they explained, lasts forever. Frank Romignano, president of the Firefighters Association, described the relief everyone felt that Michael was alive, but he also acknowledged the confusion, the disbelief, the inability to reconcile what had happened with any logical explanation. He spoke about the unity of the firefighters who'd come to search, how they demonstrated that the bonds between them weren't just words. But underneath that relief was an unsettling truth. No one knew what had actually occurred. Michael Patterson returned to work months later. He resumed his duties as captain. His family was grateful he was safe. Life continued. But the questions didn't disappear. They just became part of the background. Something that happened once and couldn't be explained. The case drew attention beyond the immediate circles of those involved. People proposed theories. Some suggested elaborate hoaxes. Others pointed to rare medical conditions. A few even speculated about more unusual explanations. Teleportation, alien abduction, phenomena that exist more comfortably in fiction than reality. But Michael's consistent cooperation with authorities, his medical documentation, and the lack of any clear motive for deception made those theories hard to sustain. What remained were the facts. A man left a ski resort in New York on a Wednesday afternoon. He vanished without anyone seeing him leave the mountain. His car, his boots, his belongings stayed behind. 6 days later, he appeared in California wearing the same clothes, with no memory of the journey and no documentation of how he'd traveled. The truck that allegedly carried him was never found. The driver never came forward. No one who encountered him during those 6 days reported seeing him. The official explanation settled on head injury and amnesia. It was the most reasonable conclusion given the evidence. Doctors confirmed the injury. The symptoms matched known patterns of concussion-related memory loss. But even the specialists acknowledged this case was unusual. The duration of the amnesia, the distance traveled, the complete absence of verifiable details about the journey itself. Michelle McQuigg, a reporter who interviewed Michael months after the incident, noted that he resigned himself to never knowing what happened. There were answers, she said, that he would simply never uncover. And that couldn't be easy. To have days of your life missing. To know you did something, went somewhere, interacted with people, but have no memory of it. To exist in a gap between what others can confirm and what you can recall. The brain, doctors explain, is more complex than previously understood. Concussions don't follow predictable patterns. What works one way in one person might work completely differently in another. Memory formation, storage, and retrieval involve intricate processes that can fail in unexpected ways. Michael's case, while extreme, wasn't scientifically impossible. It was just highly improbable, and improbable events do occur. But improbability doesn't erase doubt. It doesn't answer the secondary questions that emerge when primary explanations feel incomplete. If Michael suffered a head injury severe enough to cause 6 days of amnesia, why did he show no signs of major trauma when found? If he traveled in a truck for days, sleeping frequently, why didn't the driver become concerned enough to seek medical help or notify authorities? If he wandered Sacramento in ski gear, why didn't anyone remember seeing him clearly enough to come forward when his photo was circulated? The absence of corroborating evidence creates space for uncertainty, not because the explanation is wrong, necessarily, but because confirmation requires more than medical theory. It requires connection points between what's claimed and what can be verified, and those connection points, in Michael's case, were almost entirely absent. Consider the timeline. He disappeared Wednesday afternoon. He was found Tuesday morning. That's 6 full days. Nearly 150 hours. Driving nonstop from Lake Placid to Sacramento takes roughly 43 hours. Even accounting for rest stops, meals, and traffic, the journey shouldn't require 6 days. Where was the rest of that time spent? Michael couldn't say. The truck driver was never located to confirm or clarify. Consider the credit card. He had it in California. He used it to buy a phone. What else did he buy? Where else was it used during those 6 days? If there were purchases, they would create a trail. Gas stations, restaurants, Hotels. Financial records would show this. Investigators reviewed those records. But the details were never released publicly. That silence itself raises questions. Not because it proves anything, but because in cases where details support the stated explanation, those details are typically shared. Consider the haircut. Michael told deputies he'd gotten one from an African-American man in Sacramento, presumably at a barbershop. Barbershops keep records, appointments, walk-ins, especially when a customer arrives in full winter ski gear in California in February. That would be memorable, yet no barber came forward. No shop confirmed the visit. It's possible the interaction happened but wasn't reported. It's also possible the memory was confused or fabricated by a mind struggling to construct narrative from incomplete information. The human brain, when faced with gaps, often fills them. It creates plausible explanations for missing time. These aren't lies. They're reconstruction attempts. The brain knows something happened. It searches for reasonable possibilities, and sometimes presents them as memory. Michael may have genuinely believed he got a haircut because that seemed like something someone would do in that situation. The mind prefers stories to blank spaces. What's certain is that something happened. Michael Patterson left that mountain. He traveled across the country. He ended up in California. Those are confirmed facts. How it happened remains unresolved. The head injury explanation is plausible. The fugue state theory is possible, but neither can fully account for every aspect of the case. And that's what makes it unsettling. Not that it's unexplainable, but that the explanations available require accepting significant unknowns. Major Tibbetts said they wanted to help Michael get back the last 6 days of his life. But that assumes those 6 days are recoverable, that memories are stored somewhere, temporarily inaccessible but potentially retrievable. Modern neuroscience suggests memory doesn't work that way. If the injury prevented formation of long-term memories during that period, there's nothing stored to retrieve. Those days simply aren't there. They never were from a neurological perspective. Michael lived them, but he may never have recorded them. The search crews who spent nearly a week combing Whiteface Mountain were looking for a person who wasn't there. They searched methodically, professionally, exhaustively. They followed protocols developed through decades of search and rescue experience. And they found nothing because there was nothing to find. Not on that mountain. The assumption driving their efforts was wrong from the beginning. But how could they have known? When someone goes missing from a specific location, you search that location. You don't assume they've somehow traveled thousands of miles without detection. That assumption wasn't unreasonable. It was rational, based on how people behave, based on how the world typically works. But this case demonstrated that typical isn't universal, that reasonable assumptions can be completely wrong. And that creates an uncomfortable realization. If it can happen once, it can happen again. The circumstances that allowed Michael to vanish from New York and appear in California without anyone noticing could occur with someone else. And we still wouldn't understand how. Produce similar results? What other combinations of factors could lead to someone vanishing from one location and materializing in another with no explanation? These aren't comfortable questions. They suggest a world less orderly than we prefer to believe. They suggest that despite all our systems and technology and procedures, there are still events that slip through, that occur without proper documentation, that leave questions instead of answers. Michael returned to a life he recognized, but he also returned knowing that 6 days of that life are simply gone, not forgotten in the normal sense. Forgotten implies they were once known. These days were never known. They happened around him, not to him in any conscious way. He was a passenger in his own life for nearly a week. And that's perhaps the most disturbing aspect. Not the mystery of how he traveled, but the reality that he was there, functioning, making decisions, interacting with the world, while having no conscious experience of doing so. The doctors say this is rare, but not unprecedented. They say the brain can operate on automatic systems when higher functions are impaired. They say people in fugue states can navigate complex environments, engage in apparently purposeful behavior, and later have no recollection of it. They say all of this with confidence because it's medically documented. But medical documentation of possibility doesn't explain specific occurrence. Yes, it's possible to experience 6 days of amnesia after a head injury. But Michael was the one who experienced it. Out of millions of skiers and thousands of resorts across countless days, he was the one whose injury produced a specific outcome. And that specificity is what demands explanation. Not just that it could happen, but why it happened to him in this way, with these particular circumstances. The answer is probably mundane, a combination of bad luck and neurological vulnerability and circumstances that aligned in unfortunate ways. Nothing supernatural, nothing conspiratorial, just an unusual convergence of factors that produce an unusual result. That's almost certainly what happened, but almost certainly isn't the same as certainly. And that gap is where discomfort lives. In the space between what probably happened and what we can prove happened. In the distance between medical explanation and verified fact. In the absence of the truck driver, who should have come forward but didn't. In the 6 days that existed for everyone except the person who lived through them. Cases like this don't disappear. They just fade when people stop asking questions. Michael Patterson's story has faded from headlines. The search operations have ended. The investigation has quieted. Life has moved on, but the questions remain. Not loudly, not urgently, just persistently, waiting for someone curious enough to notice that despite all the explanations, something about this case still doesn't quite add up, and probably never will.